The ship was dying, and the stars paid no attention. They burned, as they always did, cold and distant, utterly indifferent to the fact that the Krelsa was venting atmosphere through 3 hull breaches, listing 19 degrees to the port side and emitting sounds that metal was never intended to make. Low, grinding groans, as if the framework were buckling in places it shouldn't. Vex had stopped waiting for the universe to acknowledge their predicament. About 6 days ago, she had sat at the comms console on what remained of the bridge, staring at the screens. Most were dark. 3 were still operational. They displayed numbers she had memorized on the second day, checking them every hour since, in a faint, rational hope that they would change. They did not. 14 survivors out of a crew of 209, she had counted them 3 times before accepting it. The first count gave her 210 dead, which was wrong. Then she counted again. The second gave her 28 dead, which was also wrong. The third gave her 29 dead and 14 alive. By that time, the other survivors had stopped asking her to recount and had begun the quiet process of accepting what the numbers said. The Krelsa had been a fine ship. Vex could think about that now because beauty no longer mattered. There was no pressure, no pride, no career calculations attached to it. Only a pure fact how one could admire something when it was no longer needed. She had served on it for 6 years. 6 years of deep exploration in unmapped regions of the Third Arm, cataloging gravitational formations and gas clusters, and occasionally the debris of civilizations that had once been spacefaring and now were not. Methodical work, precise work, work that did not require a careful contemplation of death. Now, she contemplated it very carefully. The air scrubbers had 20 hours of primary power left. After that, backup mode would activate. Backup would give them roughly 60 hours more, perhaps 65 if they kept physical activity to a minimum and allowed the temperature to drop below the comfort threshold. Emergency rations would last longer than the air, which was almost funny, but not funny at all. Vex ran the calculations. She had done so many times. The math did not change, and finishing the calculation provided nothing useful, so she stopped finishing it. She pressed the transmit button. The movement was automatic, natural, like breathing. This is a survey vessel of the Krel Collective, Krelsa. Registration number KCS-714. We are broadcasting on all available emergency frequencies. We have sustained catastrophic structural damage following a hostile engagement. We have 14 survivors. Life support systems are in critical condition. Our current coordinates are. She read the numbers from the screen in a level, careful voice. The voice she had used for 9 days. The one that did not crack, because cracking provided nothing. We have no maneuverability. If any ship receives this transmission, please respond on any open channel. We will remain standing by. She released the button. The silence returned instantly, full, immense. It always returned that way. The Varric had attacked them on the 9th day of their survey mission, not out of nowhere. Vex was precise by training and nature, and out of nowhere was imprecise language for a precise event. They had been followed. She knew this because, 6 days before the attack, she had pulled the passive sensor logs and found what she was looking for once she knew what to look for. A faint, cautious signature. The shadow of a ship at the edge of detection, maintaining a constant distance and never triggering an automatic proximity alert. Patient, deliberate, professional. The attack lasted 11 minutes. She did not consider this intent. The number simply fixed itself in her head, as numbers sometimes do when they are tied to events large enough to rearrange everything before and after them. The first hit. The engine core. In 4 seconds, the Krelsa went from moving to drifting. The second hit. Decks 7 through 12. 103 crew members. The third and sixth hits were so rapid they felt like one long, terrible moment. The remaining damage, the remaining dead. The transformation was complete. Then the raiders left. No boarding party, no search for survivors, no attempt to capture the data core or take prisoners. They destroyed the Krelsa with the efficiency of a creature crossing a task off a list, then departed, leaving the wreckage to drift. Vex had spent the first 3 days trying to understand it. The Varric were not known for mercy, but they were known for pragmatism. And destroying a research vessel with no material gain was not pragmatic, which meant either the destruction itself was the goal someone had paid for the ship to disappear from this region of space, or the attack was a message. Addressed to whom? To someone who hadn't received it yet. Neither interpretation helped the 4 of them. Commander Jorah was alive, and that was something. He had been in a pressure suit when the attack began, a stroke of coincidence, as his cabin on Deck 9 was now a vacuum. He lay on the floor at the back of the bridge, breathing in shallow, careful sips like a man experiencing pain without adequate pain relief. His upper left limb had been injured in the first strike. Engineer Tallis had bandaged it. Tallis was an engineer, not a medic, and his bandaging honestly reflected that. Jorah did not complain. He was 70 years old. He was an officer, a veteran of 4 assignments in disputed sectors. He possessed a quality of calm that Vex associated with people who had already faced all versions of bad outcomes and made peace with them. Not resignation, more a readiness, an acceptance of the full spectrum of possibilities that left no room for panic, because panic required surprise. And Jorah was no longer surprised by anything. "Any response?" he asked, not opening his eyes. "None, Commander." He nodded once and closed his eyes again. This was the shape of their days. "Vex broadcast," Jorah asked. Silence answered. Engineer Tallis worked in a tangle of exposed wires running along the left wall. His 4 hands moved with the concentrated economy of a person who had found a problem complex enough to fully occupy him. Vex no longer asked Tallis what he was working on. She had asked on the 4th day, and the answer was long, technical, and ended with, "This will give us about 4 additional hours," spoken in the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. She had thanked him. Red, the comms tech, hadn't risen from his cot in 3 days. He had broken 4 limbs in the first strike, and a secondary infection had spread despite everything Tallis had done. The best they could, and it was not enough. He breathed. He stared at the ceiling. He did not speak much, and when he did, his voice was thin and very distant. Junior analyst Sorvi slept almost constantly. A problem with intracranial pressure. Tallis had done what he could. Vex checked on both every 4 hours. Precisely because checking was a form of care when there was nothing else left to give, and she did it on schedule. The viewport on the right side of the bridge was the only one that remained intact. Through it, she could see the stars and, periodically, a dense, bright cluster roughly on the same line as their bow. The Krelsa had no active stabilization, so the ship drifted in a long, lazy rotation, about 1 full revolution every 18 hours, and the star cluster swept across the viewport like the hand of a very slow clock. Vex began using it to mark time. It was better than the clocks on the console, which showed hours she had stopped counting. She was watching the cluster complete its 3rd pass of the day when the console beeped a jagged, automatic sound of the distress system working on its cycle. Something else. A higher tone. A signal indicator, the one that only activated upon receiving something external. Her claws froze over the keys. The console beeped again. A second indicator lit up next to the first. The proximity ID recorder. It had been dark for 9 days because it required an automatic handshake signal from another ship to activate. She reached for the scanning system with hands that became very precise and very careful, the way her hands became when she was doing something she absolutely could not afford to do wrong. 1 contact on bearing 273, distance approximately 7 kilometers, with a large margin of error. The broken scanner estimated a large class, 400 meters in length, possibly a propulsion unit. She checked the signature against the standard database. Not Nithi, not Varric, none of the 16 species in the standard compact registry. She opened the extended file, the one for ships outside the compact network, the one she had opened twice in 6 years because it almost never mattered. The query executed. The result came back. She looked at it. She looked at the scan result again, at the distance, at the fact that the ship was simply sitting there, not approaching, not hailing, doing nothing but existing 7 kilometers off their port side in a silence that felt completely different from the silence of the last 9 days. That other silence was the silence of nothing. "It is waiting, Commander," she said. Her voice sounded level. She noted this distantly as a fact about herself, one she hadn't been sure of until it happened. Jorah was already on his feet before she finished the word. Not quickly, his injury didn't allow for quickness, but with the controlled precision of someone moving correctly. He sat in the chair next to her and looked at the screen. Distance 70 kilometers, bearing 273. He studied the scan result. His face did what it did when he processed something unexpected, a brief, perfect stillness, like the surface of water just before something large moved beneath it. "Species identification?" he asked. She told him. The word hung in the air of the bridge. Movement in the corridor. Other survivors were stirring. Rumors spread quickly on small ships, and they didn't need a comm system. Jorah looked at the viewport for a moment. The star cluster was visible, very bright. He looked at it the way people sometimes look at a fixed point when they are making a decision. When he spoke, his voice was level. It was always level. But underneath that levelness now was something Vex hadn't heard for 9 days, not once from him. She didn't have the precise word for it. Gods of the deep, he said quietly. It was a very old Krel phrase, older than spaceflight, from the era when the Krels were still inhabitants of the seabed, and the deep water above them was the most dangerous and most sacred thing their world contained. The phrase meant something between "we are in the presence of something vast and nothing remains but to meet it." They did not use it lightly. Vex understood why he used it now. She had read files on humans. Every compact officer read the files. Humans had appeared in galactic space about 140 years ago late by any comparative metric. Since most spacefaring civilizations had been traveling between the stars for centuries or longer before humans unraveled the drive equation, they arrived without any particular technological advantages. They were physically unremarkable, soft-bodied, single-stomached, dependent on artificial life support to the same degree as everyone else. Their ships were good but not exceptional. Their resources were sufficient but not vast. What they had was something the files struggled to quantify accurately. Xenopsychology reports used phrases like anomalous stress response patterns and non-standard risk calculation under threat. Older literature called it a violence instinct. The most recent analyses preferred behavioral optimization in high mortality scenarios, which was a more measured way of saying that humans responded to the possibility of death differently than other species. Not with the calculated retreat that evolutionary history had taught most sentient beings, but with something that, from the outside, looked like acceleration. They had started a war with the Dominion of Vet 30 years ago. The Vet had projected a 2-month campaign. It lasted 3. The humans won. No galactic analyst had fully predicted that outcome. Relentless. She opened the registry file the second after the identification returned. It was listed as a heavy search and rescue ship, armed. Crew of about 220. Currently deployed in the 3rd survey zone, the same as the Krelsa. She looked at the ship, sitting there in the darkness, motionless, 7 kilometers from them, not approaching, not hailing, just present, in a way that seemed deliberate, intended, as if it were waiting for something or making a decision. Vex thought about the dead air scrubbers, about the math she had stopped finishing, about Red on the cot, about Sorvey sleeping, about Jorah breathing carefully through the pain. She thought about the silence of the last 9 days and how it had felt as if she were being slowly forgotten by the universe. She thought about what she knew of humans and what she didn't know, and the gap between them. Then she pressed the transmit button. "Unidentified ship on bearing 273, she said. "This is Vex, communications officer of the Krel collective research vessel Krelsa. We have noted your presence. There are 14 survivors on board. We are not a threat. We cannot flee." She paused. Not for effect. The pause was because she truly wasn't sure what to say next, which didn't happen to her often. "We request assistance." She released the button. 4 seconds. The silence returned. Then the console lit up with an incoming transmission, and a voice sounded a human voice. Female, unhurried, with an accent that the translator rendered into flat compact standard, but which carried something underneath the translation, a texture and weight the software could relay but not fully explain. "Krelsa," a short pause, then. "We are coming to you. Hold on. Just like that. No conditions. No questions about the nature of the threat or the status of the wreckage or the political consequences of a human ship responding to a Krel distress signal in a disputed survey zone. No hesitation, no discussion. Just we are coming." Vex sat very still. Her claw on the console felt something pass through her, a completely unfamiliar sensation for which she had no precise word in Krel, although the interspecies translation files offered a human equivalent, relief. The human ship began to move. The Relentless moved as if it were in a hurry to be somewhere. Vex watched through the viewport as the human ship crossed the 7 kilometers between them. Not hesitantly, not cautiously, just evenly and directly. This is how a large predator moves when it has already decided and doesn't need to announce its intentions. It was large, larger than the scanning had suggested. Or perhaps the distance had softened the numbers, and the proximity was now doing the corrective work. 412 meters from bow to stern. She saw now the angularity, not the smooth curves of the Krel design philosophy or the layered armor of the construction. The Relentless looked as if it had been built by people who didn't spend much time asking if a ship was beautiful. They asked if it worked. It worked. Commander Jorah stood beside her at the viewport. He had risen from his cot without assistance, which told her more about his current state than any medical report she could have written. His bandaged limb hung at his side. He watched the human ship approach with an expression Vex could not read with certainty, which was unusual, because she had spent 6 years learning to read Jorah's expressions. Behind them, she heard the other survivors moving. Quiet voices, the shuffling of careful steps in low gravity. 9 days of silence and waiting had reduced their conversations to the minimum necessary. But now there was a different quality to the movement, something that wasn't quite hope, but was in its direction. Vex turned to her console. The Relentless had matched their drift rotation and was now holding position about 400 meters off their port side. She could see the running lights' white, red, and green stripes along the lower edge of the hull. She could see, through the human ship's viewport, the faint interior lighting of what appeared to be a corridor. The communication channel opened. "Krelsa, we are going to send a boarding party. Your left airlock is functional." Vex checked her panel. "Partially functional. It will operate, but the internal door seal is compromised. Behind it, we have one emergency pressure barrier." "Enough," said Captain Marsh. "We will work with that. Can you give me the crew status? How many are mobile, and how many require medical transport?" Vex went through the numbers. 9 mobile survivors, 3 mobile with difficulty, 2 requiring stretchers. As she spoke, she realized how clinical she sounded, and then realized that clinical was the right register for this kind of information exchange, and then realized that she had been thinking in several layers simultaneously for 9 days and perhaps was a little less composed than it seemed. "Understood," said Marsh. "Dr. Chen is arriving with the first team. She will address your critical cases first. Keep everyone in their places and let us come to you." "Understood," Vex said. A pause in the channel, then Marsh again. "You did well, keeping them alive for so long. 9 days is quite a bit." Vex didn't know what to answer. "Thank you, Captain," she said. The channel closed. On the bridge of the Relentless, Captain Sarah Marsh removed her headset and turned to her crew. They were watching her. They always watched her the way people watch the sky, trying to predict the weather. Not with fear, exactly, but with the specific attention that was really about reading what was coming and positioning themselves accordingly. She was aware of this. It didn't bother her. "Dax," she said. Lieutenant Marcus Dax looked up from his weapons console. He was the kind of person who seemed forever ready to say something that would be either very funny or very tactless, and he had spent most of his career carefully choosing the former. "Captain, what are we seeing?" 3 hull breaches, severe structural damage in the midsection. At least one deck is completely open to space. Weapons are offline, engines are offline. Life support is on the threshold. He looked at his screen, then back at her. Someone did a good job on them. Varric signature. The energy trace matches the configuration of heavy Varric assault weaponry, the kind they use when they don't want to be invisible. He paused. "The Krelsa was a research ship, Captain, not a combat vessel. Whoever caused this, they wanted this ship gone." Marsh looked at the wreckage on the main screen. She had been looking at it since they first caught the distress signal 4 hours ago, when she had made her decision. She had finished making the decision about 3 of those 4 hours ago. The 4th hour had been spent on the practical matters of approaching, docking, and preventing the situation from worsening. "Torsa," she said. Ensign Lena Torsa looked up from navigation. She was 23 and had been on the Relentless for 7 months. And she still sometimes wore the expression of a person quietly surprised that she was here, a look Marsh had decided would get old in about 4 months. "Captain, plot a course for drift, holding position. I want us close enough that the umbilical to their left airlock provides us a stable line. No engines after that unless I say. I don't want the exhaust hitting their cracks." "Yes, Captain, Dr. Chen." Dr. Yuna Chen was already standing at the bridge entrance with a field kit over her shoulder. She was small and fast, and had the quality of a person who had long ago decided that emergencies were her natural habitat. "I heard the status report," she said. "I need 2 medics and stretchers. Can anyone tell me what Krel physiology looks like before I go over? I can send you a compact file. I already pulled the compact file. It's 14 years out of date and clearly written by someone who has never seen a Krel. I want someone who has. There was no one on the bridge." "I'll figure it out," Chen said, already turning. "Usually I do." Marsh dismissed her. She looked at the wreckage again. 9 days, 14 survivors. Someone hit a research ship, killed 200 people, and just left. And for 9 days, out of all the space between here and the nearest compact relay, the only thing that responded to this distress signal was them, because they were 4 hours away when the signal finally crossed their detection zone. Dax was still looking at his screen. Varric raiders in this sector, he said, not entirely nonchalantly. You know, they usually don't hit research ships, unless they're protecting something or they're being paid for something. I know. That means the Krelsa wasn't supposed to research whatever it was they didn't want them to research. I know that too. And if they come back to check their work, they'll find us here, she said levelly, without intonation. Warm up the weapon systems, but keep them in passive mode. I don't want an active signature advertising what we're doing. Already warming up. She looked at him. He shrugged. You had that expression when you looked at the wreckage. I've learned to read that expression. What expression? The one that says someone is going to have a very bad day, and it's probably not going to be us. Marsh turned back to the main screen. Let's get these people off the ship first. The boarding party went through the port airlock in the cluster. 6 people in suits, moving efficiently, carrying equipment Vex didn't recognize. They were shorter than she expected. The files gave dimensions she had processed intellectually, not converted into a visual image. And the visual image now corrected several internal assumptions. They were soft-bodied and upright, and they moved with such directness that they left no room for hesitation. The one in the lead was Dr. Chen. Vex knew this from the medical bag and because she walked through the airlock already scanning the area purposefully, like a person whose work begins the moment they arrive. She saw Vex, nodded once, briefly in recognition, and said, "Where are your critical cases?" Without any preamble. Vex led her to Red. Dr. Chen crouched next to the cot, opened her bag, and began to work. Her hands were fast and small and very confident. She didn't ask for explanations of what she was seeing. She made 2 quiet sounds, one that seemed to indicate she had identified the problem, another that seemed to indicate she had a plan, and began taking equipment from her bag in a specific order. Infection and blood loss, she said to her medical staff. Not Vex. Likely a reaction to some kind of field dressing, not critical, she added, glancing briefly at Talus, who had followed them down the corridor. You saved him. That's the main thing. Now give me. Talus looked at Vex. Vex looked at Talus. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and also because watching the human doctor work held both their attention more than they had expected. Other humans dispersed throughout the ship. Vex sensed this by the background movement in the corridors. Voices that did not belong to Krel spoke quietly to each other. It should have felt like an intrusion. In reality, it didn't, because the voices weren't urgent in the sense of a threat. They were urgent in the sense of people assessing a problem. She returned to the bridge. Captain Marsh was already there. Vex hadn't seen her come through the airlock. She had just arrived, as important things sometimes just arrive. She stood in the center of the bridge, looking at the damage to the left wall with the expression of a person reading a language they knew well but hadn't heard in a long time. She wasn't tall. That was the first thing Vex noted, because for some reason the files had implied size. She was average by human standards, which meant she reached about to the top of Vex's chest. She was dressed in a gray uniform with insignia at the collar. She had short dark hair and the type of face that gave little away unless it wanted to. She looked at Vex, and Vex expected some version of a first contact reaction, a slight adjustment, a moment of strangeness. There wasn't one. Communications officer, Marsh said. Yes, Captain. You are Vex. Yes. Tell me what happened. She said it the way people say things they have said many times, not as a request, not quite as an order, but as a practical beginning to a necessary conversation from the very start. Everything you observed, Vex told her. 6 days of stalking before the attack. 11 minutes. The raiders' decision not to board. 9 days of silence. She was precise and consistent because that was how she thought and how she spoke. And Marsh listened without interrupting, which Vex noted, because people who made decisions while someone else was speaking usually interrupted. Marsh didn't interrupt. She listened to the end, and at the end, she was silent for 3 seconds that felt specific, not empty. Survey coordinates, Marsh said. What were you researching when you were found? Vex told her the region, the specific grid section, the unusual gravitational gradient that had led them to this part of the third arm, which officially wasn't mapped and officially wasn't anyone's. Marsh looked at Commander Jorah, who stood to the side, listening with half-closed eyes. Commander, do you know what is in that grid section? Jorah opened his eyes. No, he said. That is why we were there. Marsh nodded slowly. Who knows? Pause. Lieutenant Dax appeared on the bridge. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, Vex had heard him before seeing him, because he made a quiet, involuntary sound when he looked at the damage to a structural beam by the viewport, a sound mixing assessment with something else. He looked at the ceiling with the expression of a person performing mental calculations he didn't really like. "The power junctions on this deck will fail in about 3 hours," he said to no one in particular. "Maybe 4, if the engineer," he looked at Talus, "is as good as I think, judging by what's still working." Talus straightened up. "High praise," I told him quietly, Vex said. "I deduced." "Me too," said Talus. Marsh turned to Dax. "Can we stabilize them long enough for a full transfer if we run a power line from our hull?" "Yes. 6 hours of stability. More if we exceed power." He glanced at the damaged console on the far wall. "Some things we can't fix with what we have, especially structural. This ship will never fly again." "Will not fly," Marsh confirmed. Dax confirmed. Vex knew it. She had known it since the second day when Talus gave her a full engineering report, and she had read it twice and then put it where she stored information that was true and not immediately useful. But hearing it aloud from a person who had walked the ship for only 10 minutes and arrived at the same conclusion with such certainty was a different kind of knowledge. Commander Jorah heard it too. He didn't react visibly. He was too experienced for visible reactions to things he had already calculated. But Vex, who had watched him for 6 years, saw him take one slow breath and then let it out. "How long will the transfer take?" Vex asked Marsh. "For 14 people and any personal materials your commander deems essential? 4 hours, if we move efficiently?" She looked at Vex. "Does that work for you?" It was a strange question. Vex considered it, because theoretically the answer was obvious. 4 hours fit within their air scrubber window. They had limited alternatives. The answer was yes, by all rational measures, but Marsh had asked it as if Vex's assessment actually mattered in the logistical calculation. "Yes," Vex said. "That works. Good." Marsh turned to Dax. "Run the power line. I want this ship stable while we work." Dax was already heading to the airlock. Marsh stopped at the viewport. Looking at the stars and the wreckage of the outer hull sections visible at that angle, she looked at them as she had looked at everything since arriving on the bridge, not with horror, not with pity, but rather with something like pure and direct anger. Something that doesn't scream. 9 days, she said to no one in particular. "Yes, Captain," Vex said. 9 days and no one else came. It wasn't a question. Vex answered it anyway. "No, Captain. No one else came." Marsh was silent for a moment. "Well," she said, "now we are here." She turned away from the viewport and began giving instructions into her headset, and the work of getting 14 people off the dying ship began. Humans worked as if they were running out of time, even when they weren't. Vex had read enough interspecies behavioral literature to know this was a documented pattern, not a personal quirk of this specific crew. Humans worked at a baseline level of urgency that other species reserved for emergencies. They moved fast, they talked fast, they made decisions the way people throw things when they run, not carelessly, but without the pauses other species use to check if the throw was optimal. She stood at the comms console and watched them move through the Krelsa and tried to order the observation, which was difficult because there were 6 of them, and they rarely stood still. The power line was run from the Relentless within 20 minutes of Marsh's order. An engineer named Kowalski ran it personally, moving along the umbilical cable between the 2 ships in a suit, with the calm focus of a person who had done this before in conditions likely worse. He connected it to the secondary, a short exhale almost involuntary. The sound of a person who had dropped a load they had carried for 9 days. She understood it precisely. Dr. Chen moved from Red to Sorvey, and then to the 2 other heavily injured crew members with the systemic speed of a person working from a checklist she had internalized so thoroughly, it was no longer a checklist, but simply thinking. She had 2 medics. They didn't ask Vex to explain Krell biology, except for what Dr. Chen asked directly. And what Chen asked directly was specific, practical, and sometimes surprising. "Secondary circulatory system," Chen said, not raising her eyes from Red's hand. "It runs parallel to the primary, right? Lower pressure." "Yes," Vex said. "Good. I thought so. That's why he's still alive." She injected something into the injector. His primary circulatory system was affected by the infection, but his secondary compensated. "Your species has better redundancy than the files suggest." Red stared at the ceiling with slightly more awareness than he had managed for 3 days. His 4 eyes followed Chen's movements with an expression Vex identified as a combination of relief and extreme discomfort at being touched by a member of an unfamiliar species, which was reasonable and also just had to be managed. "Will I be functional?" he asked in a voice that was thin but more fully present than before. "You will be fine," Chen said. The word fine carried the flat authority of a person who had decided this was the truth and was not interested in negotiating it. Red looked at Vex. Vex looked at Red. "She is certain," Vex said. "She is certain," Chen said, still not looking up. "There is a difference." Lieutenant Dax took a portable scanner and walked the entire length of the ship, what remained of the inhabited sections, with the unhurried attention of a person reading a document in a language they were fluent in. He spoke as he walked, not specifically to Vex, although she followed him for part of the way, because it was her ship and she felt the need to accompany the assessment. He spoke like this. As a person whose thought process is partly external, words came out as they were formed, not after they were organized. "This is what I don't understand," he said, ducking under a bent cable in a corridor behind Deck 3. "The Varric hit your engine core first. Standard disablement. But then," he pointed to a section of wall where the plating had buckled inward from an external strike. "This angle. This strike came from below the ship. They were on the side. They repositioned in the middle of the fight." Vex looked at the buckled plating. They were meticulous. They were systematic. He scanned the next section. "There is a difference. Meticulous means you keep hitting until you are satisfied. Systematic means you have a specific sequence and you stick to it. They knew which systems to take in which order." He looked at her. "They've hit a Krel research ship before." She hadn't thought about it in those terms. "Now I am thinking, or they were given the schematics," she said. Dax pointed at her. "That is the other option. Yes." He kept going. "Spy theory. You read our situation report. The captain briefed us before we crossed paths 12 seconds. She briefs fast." He stopped at a sealed door to what had been Deck 7. The door held a vacuum on the other side, so it was sealed. And that was where the 103 crew members were. He looked at the door for a moment with an expression that was not neutral, but also wasn't the kind of expression that demanded acknowledgement. Then he walked on. Vex went with him. "How many research ships does the collective have in this sector?" he asked. 7 active missions in the third arm. The Krelsa was the furthest. 7, he said quietly to himself, as if adding it to something. Right. She wanted to ask him what that number meant in the context he was building. She didn't ask, because she was almost sure the answer wouldn't be immediately useful and would likely be disturbing, and she was carefully managing her consumption of anxiety. They returned to the bridge. Commander Jorah and Captain Marsh sat on opposite sides of the communications console, which wasn't officially designated as a meeting place, but had become one organically as people with authority gravitated toward it. Jorah sat upright. Dr. Chen's medicine had done its job. Vex could tell because the controlled quality of his breathing had loosened slightly. Less management and more rest. He still looked like a man who had spent 9 days sitting on the floor of a burning building, but looked like someone who had at least been given a glass of water. Marsh sat across from him, leaning forward with her forearms on her knees, not like a person asserting her presence, but like a person listening carefully. They had been talking for a while. Vex settled by the viewport and didn't interrupt. "The collective will want to know why a human ship responded to the signal before any compact member." Jorah was saying that the compact relay in this sector had been operating at reduced power for 8 months. "Your signal likely reached it on the second day. It could have been registered as low priority until the origin was confirmed," Marsh said. Jorah was silent. "Low priority. There are documents," Marsh said. And in the way she said it, there was something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the territory between them. Documents are always there. And you didn't have documents. I had a distress signal and a course. She lifted her hands briefly, a human gesture. Vex noted it. Gesture translation between species was unreliable. But this one seemed to mean something like, "What else did you need?" The third arm is listed as a joint research zone under the Compact Charter. That makes it my sector too. Jorah looked at her for a long time. "You could have passed the signal to a compact ship and continued your mission." "Yes, but you didn't." "No." Another pause. "Why?" Jorah asked. It was the same question Vex had been pondering from the first minute the Relentless appeared. She found she wanted to hear the answer, not because she expected a tactical or political explanation. She already understood that neither applied here, but because the answer to why was the part the files never fully covered. Marsh looked at the floor for a second in a special way, like a person choosing words from a larger set than they intended to share. "Because there were people on the signal," she said. "And people on a signal days away in the third arm are people who have run out of other options." She paused. "We don't need a reason beyond that." Jorah was silent. Then he said, "The vet war." Marsh looked up. I read the file. Jorah said, "When I was a junior officer 30 years ago, the projection was 2 months. The vet were larger, better equipped, and had owned this territory for centuries." His eyes were fixed on hers. "No rational probability assessment supported your outcome?" "No," Marsh agreed. "But you won. We won." The file suggested several theories. Logistic failures on the vet side, communication failures, terrain advantage in certain sectors. Pause. None of them fully explained the result. "No," Marsh said. "They wouldn't. What explains it?" Marsh looked at the viewport. The stars drifted slowly by while the Krelsa continued its long, lazy drift. She looked at them for a moment with an expression Vex couldn't accurately read, but in which there was something very old and at the same time very clear. "The vet thought we would stop when it hurt enough," she said. "They had a model. Every species they had ever fought had a point where the cost calculation outweighed the benefit, and they stopped. They were patient. They were very good at finding that point and pushing until they reached it." She turned back to Jorah. "We don't have that point. That doesn't mean you are not capable of stopping," Jorah said slowly. "Not that we don't stop all the time when we choose." She said, "It's just without drama. The difference is that we choose. It is not chosen for us by math." Vex considered this. Engineer Talus appeared in the bridge opening. He had spent the last hour with Kowalski, the human engineer, working on stabilizing the power junction. And something about that experience had left him with an expression mixing professional respect with faint bewilderment. "The junction will hold for 7 hours," he said. "Kowalski found a reserve in the secondary system that I missed." "It is amazing." "Is it?" Vex asked. Talus considered the question honestly. "Yes, it is a common system," Kowalski said from somewhere in the corridor. His voice came from the open bridge door with the casual ease of a person who didn't bother entering the room to talk and had repaired it about 40 times. Talus looked at the door. "On different ships. On this ship, it breaks about once a month." Talus internalized this. "And you didn't replace the component? We have 4 times. Pause. We order a new one. It breaks. We patch the old one. It holds. At this point, the Kowalski law states, just fix it." "The Kowalski law," Talus repeated, as if checking if it were a real thing. "I invented it myself. Very official." Vex watched as Talus processed this exchange with the focused attention of a person confronted with a logical system he hadn't modeled before. She understood the feeling. She was about to say something when Dax returned to the bridge with a scanner in his hand, and his expression was 3 degrees more serious than 20 minutes ago. He looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at him. Their gaze lasted about a second, and in that second, more information passed between them than Vex could have extracted from 9 days of sensor readings. "How long?" "The long-range passive picked them up 6 minutes ago. I wanted to be sure before raising the issue." He turned the scanner so the screen was facing the bridge. 3 contacts. The propulsion signatures were clear enough, even at long-range passive, not to leave questions about their origin. They are on an incoming vector, moving at 3 to 4 thrust, not full speed but not carelessly. Comfortable, as if they already know that nothing here will give them trouble. He paused. Estimated arrival in 5 hours, 40 minutes. 3 Varric ships. Vex froze. She was aware in the depths of her consciousness of the math she had carefully not finished for 9 days. She was aware of Red in the corridor and Sorvey on the cot, and the 11 others who had survived 11 minutes of systematic destruction and 9 days of silence. She was aware of the Krelsa around her. 20 hours of primary air, non-functional engines, a framework that was buckling degree by degree toward the point of no return. 3 Varric warships, 1 human ship. Marsh rose from the console. She reviewed the scan data methodically, then looked at Jorah, then at Dax. Her expression didn't change in any way Vex could clearly define. She wasn't afraid. Vex had seen people who weren't afraid because they hadn't realized the situation yet. She had also seen people who weren't afraid because they decided fear wasn't a useful tool right now and had put it away for later. She very rarely saw people who simply weren't afraid, the way some surfaces simply don't get wet, constitutionally, at a baseline level. She wasn't entirely sure which category Marsh fell into. She wasn't entirely sure those categories covered it. "Good," Marsh said. She said it the way one says a word that begins, not ends. The way one says, "Okay, starting. Dax, I want all weapons active in 10 minutes. Shields on standby. Engage Rodriguez on the rail systems." "Already engaging," Dax said and vanished. "Kowalski," Marsh said into her headset. Stop whatever you are doing with the junction and return to the ship. We have incoming in 6 hours. A pause in the headset. Then Kowalski's voice. How many? 3. Another pause. I'll just finish the junction, he said. 10 minutes. 8. 8, he agreed. Marsh turned to Vex. How many of your people are mobile now? 9 with minimal assistance. 2 more at full support. Red and Sorvey. They cannot be moved quickly. Marsh nodded. I want everyone who can move to transfer to the Relentless within the next 90 minutes. That will give us 4 hours before they arrive to sort out your critical cases. Send your commander to the medbay and take a position for receiving what comes. And the Krelsa? Vex asked. Marsh looked at the bridge. At the damaged walls, at the dark screens, at the viewport through which the stars drifted slowly and patiently, utterly indifferent. It held you for 9 days, she said. It did its job. Pause. We will do ours. Vex looked at the ship around her. Her ship, the one she had served on for 6 years, the one that had carried 209 people into the third arm and returned 14 of them, and felt something pass through her that she didn't try to name. She turned to Commander Jorah. He was already looking at her. His expression said everything that needed to be said, namely, very little, because some moments were only large enough for what they were. Let's go, he said. And behind them, through the bridge door, Vex heard the Relentless crew already moving fast, confidently, completely at home in a situation where there were no good options. And the sound of that was, surprisingly, the most calming thing she had heard in 9 days. The Varric fleet dropped out of FTL at 4:52, 8 minutes early. Vex registered this from the observation position Marsh had given her on the Relentless bridge, a chair at the secondary sensor console, positioned so she could read the data without interfering with the crew. It was a practical decision. She had sat there for 3 hours and 40 minutes, watching the crew conduct pre-combat checks, listening to the terminology, compiling a real-time dictionary of how a human warship prepares for battle. The short answer was loudly and with plenty of movement. The long answer was more complex, and she was still working on it. 3 contacts on the main screen. Varric Heavy Assault Class, each about 310 meters, better armed than the Relentless and operating as a coordinated unit, which significantly multiplied the disadvantage. They dropped out of FTL in a triangular formation. Experienced. Deliberate. The formation was designed so that any target firing back would have to expose itself to one of the 2 ships. No matter which direction it turned, Vex had studied enough tactical history to recognize this formation. She had also studied enough tactical history to understand what it meant when a force deployed it against a single opponent. It meant they didn't expect a long fight. It meant they didn't plan for a complex outcome. It meant they had already calculated the result and had simply arrived to confirm the math. 3 of them, said Torsa from navigation. Her voice was level, which Vex suspected was partly training, partly the contagious quality of Marsh's absolute refusal to project anything resembling anxiety. 3, Marsh said without much intonation. Dax rolled his shoulders at the weapons console. I've had worse. I'll think of something, he replied when asked. He began running targeting calibrations. His fingers moved over the keys in a fast, light pattern, as if he were playing an instrument he had learned to play when young. Rodriguez, I want the rail systems to hit the lead ship first, port and starboard both. Don't wait for my signal. Just fire upon locking. Rodriguez's voice sounded over the deck comms. Rail systems warmed up. Lock established. Good. Dax looked at the screen. Here it is. The Varric-led ship opened a communication channel. The voice that sounded had the specific kind of calm that comes from certainty. Not the uncontrolled calm of a person managing difficulties, but the deep, carefree calm of a person who does not expect difficulties. The translation sounded in flat, compact standard, but the register was clear enough. Vex had heard Varric before in trade contexts and at compact summits. She knew the register. It was the register they used when they already knew how something would end. Human ship. You are in unregistered space, operating outside your charter zone, and in the presence of a Varric enforcement action. Lay down your arms. Surrender the Krel survivors. Depart this sector and do not return. You have 3 minutes to comply. This offer will not be repeated. The bridge was quiet. Marsh looked at the comms indicator on her armrest console. She looked at it for a long time, with the expression of a person reading a document that contained something she found truly interesting. Then she pressed the reply channel. This is Captain Sarah Marsh of the United States of Humanity ship Relentless. I have 14 Krell citizens on board who needed help. And they got it. They are not going anywhere with you. Pause. Very short. As for your offer, I decline it. She closed the channel. 1 second. 2. The Varric ship fired. The first strike hit the Relentless on the port-forward shield array, and the entire ship rang as if something huge had hit it with something large. Vex grabbed the edge of her console. The lights turned amber. A dozen warning indicators lit up on all the bridges, and the sound they made was not the restless, measured tone of a ship monitoring a situation, but the sharper sound of a ship that had just taken a hit. Port shields at 72%, Torsa shouted. Hull integrity holding. Rodriguez, fire. Dax said it the way people say words they had been waiting to say. The Relentless shook differently this time, not the impact of a hit, but a deep structural vibration from the discharge of its own weaponry. The rail systems weren't the ship's largest weapons, but they were the fastest cycling, and their sound was a hard, fast percussion that Vex felt in the lower part of her chest, not heard with her upper auditory organs. On the screen, the forward section of the lead Varric ship took 2 hits in 4 seconds. Not catastrophic, not close, but not nothing. They are recalibrating shields, Dax said, counting his screen. Smart, they have good reactive systems. Torsa. Moving now, said Torsa. And the Relentless moved. Not a smooth turn, but a sharp, angular shift that pressed everyone into their seats and caused the star field on the main screen to swing about 60 degrees in about 3 seconds. Vex held onto the console with both upper limbs and made a mental note that human inertial compensation was adequate, but the working tolerance differed from Krel standards. What they considered acceptable maneuver acceleration was higher than anything the Krelsa had ever done intentionally. The second Varric ship fired from the right. The strike hit the starboard aft section, and the lights dropped to red for 2 seconds before the backup systems recovered and brought them back to amber. Something on the deck below the bridge made a sound like a structural protest. Starboard aft shield array disabled, Torsa said. Hull cracked on deck 11. Emergency hatch sealed. Is anyone on deck 11? Marsh asked. No. Then we are fine. Dax was already firing. The Relentless had heavier weaponry. Forward beams, particle systems that cycled slower than the railguns but carried significantly more energy per shot. The first beam discharge illuminated the main screen, a solid white line, and struck the second Varric ship directly in the middle. A non-glancing shot, a full impact on the main hull section. The running lights of the second Varric ship went out for 4 seconds, then lit up again, then became irregular. Damage, Marsh said. Their main power junction took a hit, Dax said. They are running on reserve, speed reduced by, he checked. About 40%, maybe more. It will take them a few minutes to sort it out. Ignore them for now. Focus 2 to 4 on the first ship. Engaged. Vex watched the first Varric ship on the screen and tried to process what she was observing in the context of everything she knew about space combat, which was mostly theoretical. The Varric were not retreating. They had expected this fight to last 3 minutes. It was clear from their formation, their speed of engagement, the confidence in their opening call. They had expected the Relentless to calculate the odds and arrive at the obvious conclusion. The Relentless was not calculating odds, or perhaps it was calculating and had simply arrived at a different conclusion. The third Varric ship swung around to the left on an attack vector aimed at the Relentless's exposed starboard flank, the one without the shield array. And Vex opened her mouth to say something, because from her console she could see the angle, and the angle was not good. Marsh already turned to Torsa. Flip us now. The Relentless flipped. Not a smooth roll, but a full axial flip of 180 degrees in about 2 seconds, which flipped the entire shield array into the path of the incoming fire and exposed the aft section of the hull, which had more armor than the right midsection, which obviously was a calculation made by Torsa without being asked, because she had already adjusted the thrust impulse to compensate for the new orientation by the time the flip completed. The third ship's shots hit the shield. The shield held. Port array at 61%, Torsa said. Still functional. Good. Continue rotation. I want us to represent a moving target, not a fixed one. The Relentless continued to rotate slowly, a long, continuous revolution that caused the star field on the main screen to rotate in a lazy circle. Vex watched the Varric ships on the tactical display, not the main screen, because the main screen was currently disorienting in ways she didn't need. This is the thing about the triangular formation, Dax said. talking while working, firing between sentences with the ease of a person accustomed to multitasking in conditions that shouldn't allow it. It's great if the target holds position. If the target doesn't hold position, the three ships are shooting around each other. He fired. A beam discharge. The shield array of the lead ship took the hit, and the screen showed a cascading failure starting along the left side of their defensive shell. Cascade on Ship 1. Torsa. Bow on 30. Left. 30 left. Firing. The left shield of the lead ship collapsed. The Relentless fired 3 rail shots in half a second at the exposed section of the hull while the shields were down. Fast, accurate. The type of accuracy that came from Dax's hands knowing where the keys were in the dark. From a calibration process, he obviously had run enough times that it was no longer a process, but a reflex. The lead ship went dark. Not destroyed, not immediately, but all engines shut down simultaneously, and the ship slowly drifted and rotated by inertia like something that had stopped deciding to move. One disabled. The second ship was still dealing with the power junction damage. Its weapons fired, but the accuracy suffered. 2 shots missed. The third grazed the Relentless's forward hull and shook the bridge. But a graze is not the same as a hit, and the damage report Torsa shouted was manageable. Deck 9 is complaining, Torsa said. Minor hull strain, no breach. Tell Deck 9 the hull will hold, Marsh said. Vex didn't ask who on Deck 9 she expected to pass this message to. The third ship understood something. Vex saw it in the tactical data. The third Varric ship adjusted speed and course, not for an attack, but for positioning. It moved to another part of the tactical space, a part that was further from the Relentless and also further from the other 2 Varric ships, as if it had decided to remove itself from a certain proximity. Ship 3 is pulling away, Torsa said. I see, Marsh said. They are retreating. Marsh looked at the movement on the screen for a second. No, they are thinking. Thinking about what? That this is not what they planned. She didn't sound happy about it. She sounded like a person observing a variable change and accounting for it. Which means, they will try something else. Dax, can we destroy the second ship before they realize what it is? Working on it. He was already launching a new target lock. The second Varric ship had restored partial power, but partial power was not full power, and the accuracy of their return fire confirmed it. Their weapon lock is slow. If Torsa gives me a stable 3-second window, I'll give you 2. Torsa said. 2 works. Torsa gave him 2 seconds of a direct course, and Dax fired a full beam charge directly into the main weapons bank of the second ship. The explosion on the screen was significant, not destruction. The ship was still there, still powered, still present, but the weapons bank was gone, and a ship without weapons in the middle of a fight is a ship that had only one function remaining, to leave. The second ship left. It did so ungracefully. It did it like something that had quickly calculated and arrived at an unpleasant conclusion and decided the conclusion was actionable. Full speed away from the combat zone and not stopping. 2 down. The third ship was still there, still thinking. Here it is, Dax said quietly. The third Varric ship opened a communication channel. This time the voice was different. Not the first speaker, a different rank, a different register. And the register was not the deep, confident calm of a force that had already won. It was something Vex had never heard before from a Varric speaker in any context. It was cautious. Human ship. This engagement has exceeded standard parameters. We request to cease discussion. This was the way Varric spoke when they wanted to stop. The bridge was quiet. Marsh looked at the screen, the disabled lead ship, drifting. The retreating second ship, becoming smaller. The third ship, sitting at a long distance and waiting. She pressed the reply channel. You attacked a research ship and killed 209 people, she said. You left 14 survivors to die in the wreckage. You came back to finish the job. Pause. There is no ceasing of discussion. She closed the channel, then looked at Dax. Finish it, she said. What happened next was not clean. Nothing at the end of the third Varric ship was clean. It tried to run. The Relentless was faster. It tried to fire back, but the return fire found only rolling shields and responded with everything the Relentless carried in its forward beam arrays. Fired in a sequence, Dax triggered like a man who had waited his whole career for exactly this fire solution. It took 4 minutes. Then the third Varric ship became a field of debris. The Relentless was the only thing that had running lights in this part of the third arm, and the bridge was very quiet for a moment, except for the ship's systems transitioning from combat readiness and Torsa reading the damage report in a voice that remained level throughout. Shields at 38%. 2 minor hull breaches repaired by emergency systems. 1 weapon array disabled. Deck 9 hull strain. Deck 11 breach already repaired. No casualties. No casualties. Vex sat at her borrowed console and looked at her hands and realized she had been holding the edge so hard that her grip had left stress marks on the composite material. She released it carefully. Commander Jorah was in the med bay. She had left him there an hour ago, and she was glad he wasn't here. Not because she thought it would disturb him, but because she thought the doctors would have a hard time keeping him in bed. Marsh stood in the center of the bridge and looked at the tactical display for a long time. The field of debris where the third ship had been, the retreating second ship now almost out of sensor range and moving as if it intended to move indefinitely, the dark, drifting wreckage of the lead ship. Then she said, "Torsa, plot us a course back to the nearest compact relay. Standard cruise speed." She looked at Dax. "Damage assessment. Full report. 1 hour. 1 hour," Dax said. He looked at his weapons console, then at the screen. "We'll need a new rail calibration after all this. That's a problem." He picked up a calibration tool from a nearby console. "About 20 minutes. Then start now." He started now. Vex looked at the viewport, at the stars and the wreckage and the dark remnant of the Varric lead ship, slowly rotating at a medium distance, covering the Krelsa, visible at the edge of sensor range, listing at 19 degrees. A ship now without a crew, 209 people. The Varric had returned to ensure no one was left to tell of what they had done here. They had been wrong. She turned to find Marsh standing by her console, not announcing her approach, looking into the same viewport. "How do you do it?" Vex asked. "Fight like this?" Vex said. 3 ships. Calculations." "We don't start with calculations," Marsh said simply. "Without drama. We start with a decision. The calculations come after." She turned away from the viewport and went back to the center of the bridge, already loading the damage report onto her armrest console. Already onto the next problem. Vex turned back to the stars. The field of debris caught the distant starlight, as debris always did, scattered, drifting, silent. Space was now very good at making big things small after the fact. She thought of the relay station, somewhere out there, where her distress signal had been registered as low priority. She thought of the word waiting. She thought of the Relentless appearing instead. She turned back to her console and began writing her preliminary incident report. Not because someone had asked her to, because a communications officer submitted reports, and she was still a communications officer. And some things needed to be kept, not because they were useful, but because they were hers. They had left the Krelsa on the second day. Not immediately, not without reflection. Commander Jorah had asked from the Relentless medbay if there was any possibility of a salvage claim, and the human engineer Kowalski had walked the wreckage for the last time with a scanner and returned, shaking his head in the honest manner of a person who respects another enough to tell them the truth clearly. The framework cracked in 2 places, and the third hull breach opened further while we fought, he said. She isn't going anywhere on her own power, and towing at warp speed will finish what the cracking started. He paused. She held long enough. Jorah looked at the medbay ceiling for a moment. "Yes," he said, she held. Marsh had offered to cleanly scuttle the Krelsa. A full system reset. No wreckage that the Varric or anyone else could dig through in search of data cores or research logs. Jorah accepted. The reset was fast. Vex watched this from the Relentless viewport with her arms folded and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be proportional to what she had seen, and she had learned over the last 10 days that things which were too large for language were best met with silence, not words that couldn't carry such weight. The Krelsa left quietly, the way good ships should leave. The Relentless went at 3/4 speed to the nearest compact relay point, a journey of about 4 days at that pace. The reduced speed was a concession to the structural stress on Deck 9. "Not critical," Kowalski said, "but worth being careful about." And Marsh made this concession without discussion, which Vex noted as a data point on how Marsh weighed speed against the safety of her crew. The calculation wasn't even close to requiring discussion. The 14 surviving Krel occupied part of the living quarters on Deck 6. The Relentless had space. It was built for a crew of 220, and Marsh managed it with 194, which left space that was used for equipment, storage, and emergency capacity. The crew cleared the section in about 3 hours on the first day. Reluctantly, practically, as this crew did most things. Vex had a cabin to herself, small by Krell standards, which meant about the right size by any reasonable measure. She slept in it for 6 hours on the first night, and woke in the darkness and lay still for a long time, listening to the Relentless around her. The deep, steady hum of its engines, the rare, distant sound of crew on the night rotation. The ship breathed the way a healthy ship breathes, even a controlled one. All systems worked as intended. She hadn't heard a ship breathe like that in 10 days. She lay still and listened to it for a while before getting up. Red was in the med bay, which occupied a significant part of Deck 4 and was staffed around the clock by Dr. Chen and her 3 medics. The infection was responding to treatment, not fast enough for Red's pleasure, which he expressed by asking Chen every 4 hours, "How much longer will I be here?" And Chen expressed her answer by continuing to treat him at the same pace, regardless of the question. She didn't change anything. "When I ask," Red said on the second day when Vex visited him. "No," Vex said. "I have asked 6 times." "I know." He looked at the ceiling. "At least this is a different ceiling." Sorvi was recovering more slowly. The problem with intracranial pressure required careful management and constant monitoring. The medicine doctor, Chen, synthesized from the Relentless supplies after reading the Krel medical files at the same speed other people process food. Sorvi slept most of the time, which, according to Chen, was correct and expected, and in itself was a form of healing. "His brain is working. Sleep is work," she said. "Will he be fully functional?" Vex asked. "Ask me again in a week." She said it not as an evasion, but as a precise answer. One that meant, "I don't know yet, and I won't tell you what I know, but I'm not worried," which for the record is a significant statement. It was, Vex decided, a significant statement. On the 3rd day, Marsh found Vex in an auxiliary observation bay at the stern of the ship. The observation bay was a small room with a large, curved viewport built for looking at things, which Vex used in large quantities, because looking at the stars from inside a ship that wasn't dying felt like something that required regular acknowledgement. The stars were the same stars. They hadn't changed. She herself had changed in relation to them, and sitting with that change felt important. Marsh entered, looked at the viewport, and sat in the second chair with the ease of a person who had been in this room many times. They sat in silence for a moment. "How are your people?" Marsh asked. "Better," Vex said. "Red is recovering. Sorvi is stable. The others," she considered the word, "are adapting. Adapting. 10 days ago, we were 209, she said simply, without intonation, because intonation would imply there was an emotional register for that sentence, and she didn't know what that register was. Now we are 14. That is a large adaptation." Marsh was silent for a moment. "You lose people?" Vex asked. "Yes, often more than any of these tasks should require." She considered the question before answering more fully. "Fewer than before. We have become better at dealing with some things that used to kill us. Not all." Pause. "We still have the habit of going where we probably shouldn't. To the 3rd arm," Vex said. "Among others." Vex looked at the viewport. The star cluster in the far distance, dense and bright, catching the ship's long attention. "Files about your species describe this as a risk calculation failure," she said. "A behavioral tendency. They call it an evolutionary leftover, something that was useful when humans lived on one planet. And now," she paused, "badly calibrated for the actual threat environment." Marsh made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What?" Vex asked. "That's a very polite way of saying it. What would be an impolite way? That we are a species that was almost destroyed so many times on our home planet that the survivors were the ones who couldn't stop fighting, even when stopping was the smart choice." She said it without self-pity, as a fact that was old enough to be just a fact. The vet thought it was a flaw, something that could be used against us. Wait long enough, cause them enough pain, and the calculation will change. She turned to look at Vex. "The calculation doesn't change. It's the floor." Vex processed this. "The floor," she said. "The lowest point where we go, where we stop falling." Marsh looked at the viewport again. "You can push us down to it. The vet did it. A lot of others tried, but you can't push us through it." "Is this why you came?" Vex asked. When you received the signal, Marsh was silent for a moment. "I came because there were people who needed help. That is the entire answer. There is no more complex version. The files suggest, the files try to explain something in a language that was built for other things." She said it without irritation, as a simple observation. "You can't fully explain why a human runs into a burning building by talking about evolutionary psychology. The explanation is true and at the same time completely misses the point." She turned to Vex. "The point is that there were people in the building." Vex looked at her. You ran to the building. This is what we do, Vex said. The silence was clean and complete, one that didn't need to be filled. Vex thought about the 9 days. She thought about the distress signal that went out 87 times and returned with nothing 87 times. The silence was so constant and complete that she had begun to mistake it for the true state of the universe in this matter. She thought about the small moment when the console beeped with an incoming signal, and she hadn't allowed herself to feel what she felt, because feeling it before she knew what it was would have been her own special cruelty. And then it turned out to be a human ship. And then, we are coming. Hold on. I have a question, Vex said. Ask. When you heard the distress signal, before you knew who we were, what species, if there was any political reason for the response, was there a moment when you considered the possibility of not coming? Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then she said, no. One word, flat and clean, and not offered as courage, as some species would have done, just as a fact about a decision. In the decision, there was no such option. Vex turned back to the stars. She thought about the compact relay station that had registered the signal as low priority. She thought about the 16 spacefaring species in the standard registry, none of whom had come. She thought about a human ship that operated outside the standard registry, the one that arrived anyway. She said after a while. This is very strange. I know, Marsh said. The files don't cover it adequately. They never do. Short pause. Although I appreciate the effort. Vex looked at her. Marsh's expression was one she was slowly learning to read over the last 3 days. It was a very dry expression. It lived on the border between serious and non-serious. And it crossed that border so fast that the only way to track it was to stop trying and just accept the ambiguity. Thank you, Vex said. Marsh turned to look at her. For responding to the signal, Vex said. For the boarding party, for Dr. Chen, for the battle. She thought about the words and found them insufficient, and yet said them, because insufficient words were better than silence at this particular moment of arrival. Marsh held her gaze for a moment. Don't thank me, she said. File a complaint with the compact about their relay station. Then she stood and left. Vex sat with the viewport and the stars for a long time after that. They reached the compact relay point on the 4th day. The Krel Collective's response ship was already waiting. The relay station had transmitted the signal as soon as the Relentless made contact, and the Collective moved fast, when it had a target to move toward, which now was. The Krel response ship was larger than the Relentless and arrived with the specific energy of an organization that had spent 10 days dealing with the political and logistical aspects of losing a research ship and was now facing the human and emotional aspects of discovering that some of the crew were alive. The transfer took 2 hours. Jorah walked through the docking corridor on his own, which the Krel response ship's medical team had tried to prevent, and he refused to be prevented. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, a point where the Relentless deck ended and the Krel ship began and turned back. Marsh stood at the entrance to the dock. He looked at her for a moment. Then he placed his right upper limb on his chest. An old, formal Krel gesture from a cultural register that was rarely used in modern contexts. A gesture meaning, I acknowledge a debt that has no transaction. Marsh placed her right hand on her own chest, a human gesture, the origin of which Vex didn't know, but recognized in the way one recognizes something that clearly conveys information across a chasm. It had no technical reason to be crossed. Jorah turned and walked onto the Krel ship. Vex was the last to cross. She stood at the entrance to the Relentless dock with the report already submitted. The preliminary incident documentation had been submitted to the Collective's intelligence office at the relay station 3 hours ago, containing everything she had observed, calculated, and concluded over the last 10 days. The full attack report, 9 days of silence. The human ship, what it did, and what humans were, or as close to it as possible in the format of an official report, which was a format that carried facts very well and texture less well. She looked at the Relentless crew working around her, completing docking procedures, moving with their characteristic directness, speaking with the volume of people who had long ago decided that life was shorter than it seemed. And there was no reason to be quiet about it. Dax was calibrating the rail system. He had been calibrating it, on and off, for 2 days. He did it in the manner of a person who was slightly irritated by the equipment. He also clearly liked how you were irritated by something you trusted. Torsa was conducting post-transit navigation checks, calling out numbers in the clear, level voice that Vex had begun to associate exactly with her. Dr. Chen was in the medbay, which she apparently hadn't left except for sleep, continuing to conduct diagnostics on patients she had already stabilized, because stabilized is not the same as finished. Kowalski was somewhere in the lower decks, talking to the power junction, and Marsh stood at the far end of the docking corridor with a tablet in her hand, and 3 different crew members were trying to get her attention simultaneously, and she was answering all 3 in the unhurried, sequential manner of a person who wasn't going to hurry and didn't need to announce that fact. Vex watched all of this. She turned to Marsh, who noticed her still standing at the entrance. Marsh noticed most things and nodded briefly across the distance. Vex responded. Then she crossed the threshold to the Krel ship. The incident report was entered into the collective's official record 4 days after Vex's return. It was flagged by the Intelligence Department, then by the Diplomatic Department, then by the Admiral Command Department, which read it twice and forwarded it to 3 other departments with a personal annotation that Vex never saw but heard of later in the specific way that official annotations sometimes became unofficially known. The annotation reportedly read, "Read this carefully, then read the part about what they did when the 3 warships appeared. Then tell me what our policy on responding to distress signals in the third arm says." The signal response policy was revised within 6 months. The Varric raiders did not return to the Third Arm Survey Zone. Not in that month, not in that year, not in the years that followed. The Collective's intelligence service conducted an analysis of Varric movement patterns in the region, and the conclusion was simple. The raiders had revised their operational assumptions after the engagement. The Third Arm was now a zone where human ships operated and responded, and did not perform the retreat calculation that, by all reasonable models, should have concluded the engagement before it began. Varric were pragmatists. Pragmatic entities update their models. Among the spacefaring community, the incident caused a specific attention that sometimes generates quiet things. Not the loud attention of a battle illuminated by relay broadcasts, but the cautious, private attention of intelligence departments and tactical analysts and representatives of species at compact summits who read Vex's report and discussed it in the measured language of people who had recalibrated their models. What none of the reports captured, and what Vex realized none of them would capture, was the weight of a beeping console on the 9th day. The specific quality of those 4 seconds of silence after she transmitted, the silence before Marsh's voice sounded. The texture of the words, "We are coming, hold on," how they were small, full, and completely sufficient. She wrote the final page of her personal journal, an unofficial report that had already been submitted, a private document that was not for the collective, not for the intelligence department, not for the diplomatic department, and not for any of the departments that would revise their policy and update their models after the incident. She wrote it for herself. Because some things needed to be said somewhere, even if only for a record that no one else would read. The signal remained unanswered for 9 days, she wrote. The universe is very large and mostly indifferent. And 9 days of silence is enough to learn this in a way that no theoretical study covers. On the 10th day, a human ship answered. Files on human behavior describe a species with poor risk calibration, high aggression thresholds, and an anomalous attitude toward survival calculation. The files are accurate in all these points and mistaken in what they mean. What do they mean? It is this. When the signal was sent, the human ship came. Not after discussion in a committee, not after a policy review, not after a calculation that weighed risk against return. Just, "We heard you, we are coming." I do not fully understand humans. I am no longer sure the files are the right tool for this. What I know is that there were 14 of us, and the ship that came had 219 people on board, and not one of them hesitated. This is the complete and final report of what I observed. It is enough.